exploring how we can master ourselves by looking at how authors and experts say it is possible, with your host, Sexuality. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 79 of How to Be with me, Sexuality, as your timid presenter, guiding you through life's tricky topics and skills by reading through the best books out there. Before we begin, I want to introduce another podcast that I recommend. They say it's a man's world, so what does that mean for the rest of us? I wanted to take a minute to tell you about a new podcast series that is answering that question. From authors and politicians to athletes and activists, the Story of Women podcast features interviews with those who explore our world through the female gaze. And they've just launched a new season looking at change and how women make it happen. Every episode, the host Anna Stecklin speaks with women at the top of their industries who are leading social and cultural change. I'm most excited for the first episode, which features a first-time ever exclusive joint interview with Hillary Clinton and Cherie Blair, a leading international human rights lawyer and wife of the former British Prime Minister. I'd say these women know a thing or two about driving change for sure. The season also features a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Afghanistan's youngest ever female mayor, a co-creator of the Black Lives Matter movement, an indigenous environmentalist from Chad, and much, much more. For real change to happen, we need to hear more of women's voices. So be sure to subscribe to The Story of Women, wherever you get your podcasts.
There's a difference between having and exercising rights and having and exercising power. And so this is a long strain in human history that the question of women's power is a very frightening one.
We often talk about housing and the lack of affordable homes. According to the EU, shelter is important because it provides security, personal safety and protection from the weather, and prevents ill health and disease. Adequate housing provides people with dignity and the opportunity to lead a normal life. Shelter therefore plays an essential role in reducing vulnerability and building resilience. So why does it matter to you? Here is Irene Abbou, who is an ICF-certified coach trained in the Gottman Method for couples therapy and double certified in positive psychology, on her thoughts.
Shelter and stability at home are basic human needs. To function optimally, the human body needs to balance their masculine doing skills with their feminine being skills. In our professions, we're naturally achieving and reaching linear goals. This means we're using our masculine skills. This also means we're in our sympathetic nervous system of fight, flight, and freeze. To not burn out, we must tap into our parasympathetic nervous system at home. This is our rest and digest system. Without this balance of work and rest, we end up feeling anxious, exhausted, and lose our sense of meaning and purpose. Perpetually living in instability at home is what triggers life-threatening diseases.
Our first book is from Kieran Yates, who is a journalist, broadcaster, and author. She writes regularly on youth culture, housing, immigration, and politics for publications including The Guardian, The Independent, and Vice. She recently produced the BBC Radio 4 documentary Estate Music, which explored the link between music, immigrant communities in the UK, and social housing. All the Houses I've Ever Lived In is her first solo book. I was fortunate to speak to the author, hence here is a snippet of our chat. But find the full interview on www.howtobe247.com or on the YouTube channel.
You know, it was challenging, as writing about ourselves often is. But it was like a forced revisiting of a certain kind of past. So I thought of my past as something that was filled with various kind of pop culture injections, like Missy Elliott and, growing up on Bollywood and our political reckoning and, siblings and like food and fun and school. And moving from place to place was just kind of a normal thing that people do. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that some of my experiences were quite unusual. And, in the writing of this book, I both realized how disruptive so much of my early experiences were and continue to be throughout my adult life as well. And so there was a little bit of like me reckoning with that part of my life that I'd kind of just shrugged off, time I was in my 20s and I would move to so many places, I was right on the hard edge of the recession, like lots of my peers were. And my mind, moving from private rental accommodation to private rental accommodation was just normal. Rents escalate, you get no-fault evictions, you are served, that this is just the part and parcel of life. And in the writing of this book, I realized that no, this is not part of parcel. These are not the terms that we should be forced to accept. And so it was like, it was re-looking at my life through the lens of reality and justice. I've lived in lots of different places, obviously, and they've all taught me something about home. But even in the writing of this book, the sort of landscape of housing has got worse because our economic backdrop has got worse. We are experiencing pay freezes. We are experiencing gender and ethnic pay gaps, which obviously lead to housing gaps. The housing crisis has become a public health emergency. So my story is now the story of the 17.5 million people in the UK who do not have secure, stable and safe housing. So the things that I'm writing about is increasingly the experience of lots and lots of people. I haven't experienced all the hardest edge of housing like street homelessness, but I have known what it means to be in temporary accommodation, to have your estate, facing demolition, to live in places not designed to be lived in, to, live on your own and be in receipt of benefits. And that's before you go to student accommodation and living in mold-filled homes and, all of those kinds of things. So in my view, housing is the thing that all the other issues in our society orbits around. And it's imperative that we act on making that safe and secure and accessible to everybody. Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a book about moving. So as much as it's about moving from place to place, it's also about the things that we bring with us and the things that we leave behind. And the things that we bring with us become more sentimental and become more meaningful because they turn into things that have followed you within 5 house moves and then 10 house moves and then more and more. And so I write about the kind of nostalgic relationship I have to a fake gold plastic tissue box, which, you might have seen in lots of Punjabi houses, certainly across the South Asian diaspora. And, I talk a little bit about the cultural history of how these came to get into Britain, but there is no clear year zero, but a lot of them originated in India during the Mughal Empire and then moved through and basically made their way here to various houses, various high streets for like a $5 you could get from the local market. But they speak to this idea of opulence. They speak to a historical idea of, the Indian relationship with gold. And they also speak to sharing networks. There's a reason why lots of immigrant communities have uniform aesthetics. And it's because there were these sharing networks where you'd come to the UK for the first time and people would give you a tablecloth, and they give you the same plastic tablecloth, and they give you these things, and you start to realize these details, and you understand that the objects that we bring with us have a clear link to our migration history. And it kind of, in the book, it leads me to talking about how the history of housing activism in this UK, especially in its immigrant communities, is so rich. And thanks to those very early fights that were fought in the 1970s in, Black, West African, Caribbean communities and in South Asian communities, we are able to exist as we exist today. So, we have much to be in gratitude for. I reported at Grenfell on the fire at Grenfell during the time, and obviously I write about it in the book, and I speak to some tenants who were in temporary accommodation in hotels in West London, for 2-3 years, and it really speaks to the negligence of Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council. It speaks to the sort of negligence braided into the whole system, not only of the specific case, but of social housing at large. And even during the Grenfell inquiry, as I was watching it and reporting on it, I was completely taken aback with the disrespect that ex-residents were treated with. Victims of trauma were being called aggressive. People who were advocating for their own rights, for their own safety, for, fire doors they closed properly, were really demonized by various powers that be. And it just tells us such a story about how power dynamics exist in our current housing structure. And also the way in which homeowners and social housing tenants and landlords and estate agents have all been trained to see themselves as separate interest groups. We know that the housing crisis is intersectional. We know that it's all interconnected. We know that this affects all of us equally. But this government and governments over the last 10 years have encouraged us to see ourselves as separate interest groups and to create winners of losers of the crisis. And the losers are often people who are the most vulnerable, are the most marginalized. And my book hopefully gives us ways that we can not only push back, but also delight and revere and respect communities which are so often overlooked.
This is a poignant memoir about Yates's search for a sense of belonging and identity through the various homes she has lived in throughout her life. The book is divided into chapters, each one focusing on a different house or apartment that Yates has called home, and explores the memories, emotions, and experiences associated with each of them. The book begins with Yates's childhood in a council estate in North London. She describes the tight-knit community she grew up in, where everyone knew each other and looked out for each other. She talks about how many Punjabi houses across the UK, including her first home, built their aesthetic through migrant-sharing networks that helped people get on their feet, which is why personal items such as an actual gold-laden tissue box from the Punjab was considered treasure and a connection to her heritage. Psychologists put nostalgic objects in our homes into two categories: personal objects and linking objects. Personal objects refer to sentimental items that take us back to an individual time and place. Linking objects which tap into a cultural or ancestral memory and take us elsewhere, unlike personal objects, which take you to a place where you may have bought it. These linking objects are tangible ways to make our abstract memories real, to write the poetry of imaginary homelands into our living rooms. Yates also writes about the racism and violence she and her community experienced, both from their white neighbours and from the police. Throughout the 1970s, far-right white fascists like the National Front regularly drew blood. South Asian locals, worried about being targets of racist violence, implored the pub owners, might they please not invite droves of people to kick their heads in, as she says. Their request was denied. What followed was an almighty fire at the pub which took place about 200 metres from the house that Yates' mum grew up in, and ignited some of the most violent race protests in this country's history, known as the Southall riots. A New York Times article from the next day reported on busloads of skinheads arriving in Southall to fight, describing the aftermath of the streets that included Beresford Road as a combat zone, and reporting on attacks with petroleum bombs, streets littered with bricks and glass, shattered shop fronts and burnt-out cars. One-time Tory Minister of Health, Enoch Powell, raised alarmist panic in the now infamous speech known as the Rivers of Blood. The seismic divides between us and them, articulated in his speech, placed a national debate about immigration, integration, and race relations on the front line, viewing immigrants as unwelcome aliens and creating a language of fascism that braided itself into the fabric of British life that we still see today. Powellism still informs much of the government policy today, from the Home Office and its relentless attack on migrants, to the mistreatment of the Windrush generation, the political legacy of Islamophobia, and referendum campaigns fought on the lines of immigrants taking your jobs, space, and resources. Homes occupied by immigrants were neglected, and banks refused to lend to many Black and Asian borrowers. In 1976, 34% of West Indian and 41% of Asian households were allocated housing which was overcrowded, compared to only 11% of the white population. This gave rise to the myths of overpopulated immigrants spilling out, ready to take over the white heartland of Britain, overbred, fertile, and ready to attack. Yates says communities fought back. One of the reasons that many families across the UK were able to acquire housing was thanks to the work done by grassroots activist organisations like the Asian Youth Movements, AYM, and Black Power campaigns that took place nationwide across London, Manchester, Sheffield, Burnley, Leicester, and beyond. They fought for housing legislation and demanded anti-racist policies that thousands of immigrants benefit from today. As a result, the Pakistani Progressive Group worked alongside the Indian Workers' Association, the Bengali Housing Action Group, Manchester's Arawak Housing Association, and the Baha'i Kubo Housing Association Limited were created to aid renters and remains the only Filipino housing association of its kind in Europe. One tactic that activists used to fight back was by providing mortgage committees. They helped tenants who were excluded from mainstream banking by enabling them to put down deposits. Activists would pay into a pot anything from, say, £1 a week for the primary purpose of raising a mortgage down payment, but the money also funded financial literacy and administrative aid and translation services. A version of this took place in some Jamaican communities in the 1950s and 60s. They relied on interest-free saving systems like the Padna. A similar system called Susu existed in many West African communities, allowing poorer members to draw ready cash in emergencies or when their credit status made them ineligible for loans from high street banks. A group of partners agreed to pay a regular sum or hand to a trusted person or a banker, usually an older respected member of the community, on a weekly basis to be shared and allocated to housing costs, building security on money raised by the community for the community. Yates talks about the power of the Bengali Housing Action Group in the 1970s, and the fact that the history of the struggle is one of the reasons why the beautiful interiors of many immigrant homes continue to be a retreat from a hostile and grey world outside. Despite these challenges, she remembers her childhood as a happy and loving time, filled with family, friends and adventures. However, her mum was struggling with the cultural penalty of trying to leave her union. When she finally and bravely filed for divorce, she was at the age of 19 with a small child, swiftly disowned. Yates says disownment in economic terms is a big deal. In its most acute form, it's not a punishment you bounce back from. It means no generational wealth, no financial support, no offers of a place to stay when you need it. This was the beginning of a housing precarity that would become the constant of their lives. But they both entered it with the knowledge that you can make your home anywhere, with small objects that connect you to a community, time, or a place. The first place she stayed was in social housing negligence. In 1993, after years of short stays with various friends and on the couches of distant family members, her and her mum finally settled into a third-floor flat on the Greenman Lane estate in West Ealing. There were small, jagged shards of pebble dash on the walls. In reality, pebble dash is just a composite of limestone, sometimes mixed with sand and gravel, that's literally dashed onto external walls. It has been used on Britain's walls since the 1890s as an insulation cladding, but mostly it is used to hide shoddy brickwork and has subsequently become an aesthetic tied to council housing. It is now so unfashionable it can reduce the value of a property by up to 5%, and it also is impossible to remove. It also conceals negligence. If the pebble dash coated external walls concealed things you didn't want people to see, then the paper-thin internal ones failed to conceal the things you didn't want people to hear. She said she would put paper-thin as being around 11 to 12 millimeters. However, the upsides of the close proximity to one another that social housing has provided is one of the reasons that music has been able to mutate and evolve so effectively in this country, from makeshift sound systems to Eastern European techno. The history of the music from immigrant communities creating new sounds has been long documented. Over the last 50 years, the residents of British council estates have seen reggae, lovers rock, rap, grime, and Afrobeat all develop and thrive. Unfortunately, there's no real research about the cultural benefits that come from living on estates at all. However, London-based artist Yuri Suzuki, a Japanese sound designer, says, "When we can hear other humans, we feel safe. Too much silence has been shown not to be good for humans." Yates then discusses the building structure. This history begins with the well-intentioned 1919 Housing, Towning, Planning and Act, or as it is better known, the Addison Act, named after the then Minister of Health and Housing, Dr. Christopher Addison. He was a breed of politician that is unfortunately increasingly rare. A doctor, advocate of national insurance, and later a Labour Party member who was motivated by a social conscience. The Addison Act promised government subsidies for the building of working-class housing, which meant that for the first time, housing became a national responsibility for all local authorities. The Act was partly the result of a campaign to improve the design of working-class homes and a pledge by Prime Minister David Lloyd George in November 1918 to provide habitable homes for the return of soldiers of the First World War, a scheme known as Homes Fit for Heroes. These soldiers, it's worth noting, were assumed to be white, neatly erasing the contributions of black and brown soldiers from across the colonies, who should also rightfully have had a significant claim to this housing. They were often not granted it. The concept of a whole lifespan built into the architecture of an estate is not a new one. This idea didn't always work in practice. Almost immediately, social housing became a site of derision and neglect. Since the 1980s, the amount of social housing in the UK has steadily declined. One of the reasons for this is the Conservative right to buy policy, first introduced in Margaret Thatcher's 1980 Housing Act, which allowed tenants in council housing opportunities to buy their homes with state subsidies. This essentially privatised the housing stock, which played a big part in the crisis we see ourselves in now, by creating a huge deficit of social housing that was sold off and never replaced. The good houses and nice estates were sold, leaving stock that no one wanted to live in, let alone buy. In 2017, council homes were sold off almost 3 times as fast as new ones were built, which should have sounded alarm bells. In 2021, just 6,644 social homes were built across the whole of England. But in the same period, we lost 28,796 social homes to sales and demolitions. Affordable housing, which isn't really affordable to the lowest income sections of society, is increasing, while real accessible social rented housing is declining. This affects us all. But in 2017, the Race Disparity Audit showed that the households most likely to rent social housing were the African, Caribbean, Black Other, whatever that stratum refers to, Bangladeshi, Irish, Arab, and mixed groups. Ownership of homes is also increasingly divisive in areas that have more readily accessible nature than cities. Before the pandemic, government figures showed that 495,000 households in England had second homes. The homelessness charity Crisis reports that as of 2021, around 227,000 people were experiencing the worst forms of homelessness: rough sleeping, sleeping in vans and sheds, and stuck in B&Bs across England, Scotland and Wales. And in the same year, over 1 million households across the UK were waiting for social housing, and 1 in 10 people wait 5 years to find a home. On those lists are some of this country's most at-risk people: homeless trans people, disabled people, refugees, sex workers. All are waiting for protections that can mean the difference between life and death. And of course, Yates talks about the devastating incident of the morning of 14th of June 2017, when the Lancaster West Estate's Grenfell Tower was set ablaze by a faulty refrigerator. The number of deaths rose over the next few days: 10, then 17, then 18, 45, 60, and then finally 72. The group of tenants known as the Grenfell Action Group, or GAG, tried to make change in 2016 and failed. The GAG website details power surges on the estate in 2013, which went ignored, as well as multiple other warnings lodged with the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation. Grenfell was an avoidable disaster, with architectural negligence built in. Let's take the use of the external cladding: highly flammable Renobond PE, aluminium panels containing a plastic filling used by a cost-conscious council. While zinc cladding was initially considered when the tower was refurbished in 2015, Renobond PE was a cheaper option, saving nearly £300,000. This is a process known as value engineering. Grenfell is now a byword for negligence. Of the residents that died in the fire, 85% were from ethnic minorities. In 2017, data showed that the majority of children who lived above the 4th floor of the tower blocks in England were Black or Asian. It was members of the Muslim aid organisations who did the hands-on work on the ground alongside citizen volunteers who came from across the country. It's horror on top of horror when Yates visits displaced residents months and months down the line and realises many were still housed in hotels and worse, shipping tanks. Yates herself was also threatened with rehousing after the Green Man Lane estate. The decent homes standard is set by the government, which has historically said that homes should be warm and weatherproof, and with reasonably modern facilities. However, this definition is at the time of writing under review. In short, what constitutes a decent home in the eyes of the government is unclear. At the time of writing, the website copy reduces the estate to 4 bullet points, describing it as suffering from antisocial behaviour, derelict garages, drug dealing and crime, too many one-bedroom properties and a lack of 4-bedroom properties. Sadly, the building estate is now dilapidated and no longer in use. In the next house in Yeading Lane, it was a 1-bedroom home for her mother, brother and herself. And there were threats of bailiffs, and her mother had a number of jobs on 0-hour contracts or cash in hand. In 2022, The Guardian reported concerns about the employment model used by bailiff firms, where agents are self-employed workers who earn commission based on their caseload, rather than employees with a salary. One advert for a major bailiff firm, which describes those with a military, police or prison background as desirable candidates, offered uncapped commission, with realistic earnings between £35,000 and £65,000, well above the average national salary. These financial incentives make for scary realities. More recently, bailiffs have become glorified as moral crusaders through popular bloodlust TV shows such as Can't Pay, We'll Take It Away, Beat the Bailiff, and Call the Bailiffs, Time to Pay Up. What's scary is the fact is, many of us are closer to a bailiff visit than we think. Before the pandemic, referrals to bailiffs had been rising rapidly, with about 3 million civil enforcement cases in 2019, according to the Centre for Social Justice, an increase of more than 600,000 in 5 years. And fear is big business. Private doorbell cameras, which the Met call domestic CCTV, have seen a huge increase in sales. In the US, it tells that in 2016, the size of the doorbell camera market was $252.1 million. By 2025, it's set to be valued at $2.8 billion. However, in 2021, the Centre for Research and Evidence on Security Threats shared research that showed that fitting these doorbells could even make your home more unsafe, giving an affluence cue to potential burglars. Yates says one of the most used techniques to enhance relations between warring neighbours is mediation, which is usually advised before legal costs spiral out of control in the courts. Teaching these techniques in mutual aid groups or Zoom workshops for communities funded by government or local organisations as a standard could bring enormous benefit. Looking back, she says what would have helped her, her mum and everyone in that house really was to dissipate those fears into smoke was simply more information. We need to be able to abolish systems of oppression, she says. One of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, Patrisse Cullors, in her book An Abolitionist's Handbook, 12 Steps to Changing Yourself and the World, tells us that in order to have an abolitionist approach to community problem solving, we must start small in our communities and work from there. It might be increasingly up to us as neighbours to learn what to do when bailiffs and immigration officers turn up on our street as we ward off the most aggressive government policies. As Yates grows older, her family's financial situation improves, and they move to a much larger house in a more affluent area of Wales. However, Yates struggles to adjust to the new environment, feeling like an outsider amongst her wealthy classmates. She also experiences a sense of displacement and loss, mourning the loss of her old home and the community she left behind. In her late teens and early 20s, Yates moves to different apartments and houses in London as she pursues her career as a journalist. She writes about the excitement and freedom of living independently for the first time, as well as the challenges of navigating the city's competitive and often isolating social scene. Yates also reflects on her relationships during this time, including a tumultuous romance with a musician and a close friendship with a roommate. The truth is that every element of the housing market is gentrified and unequal. Gentrification prices people out of their homes, especially those from global majority communities, aggravating and corroding historical communities, and particularly black spaces. Gentrification is a national concern and rural areas are not immune. In 2021, house prices in the countryside rose by 14%, twice as much as in cities. This rural gentrification is thanks to a myriad of factors. New buyers and renters who have responded to the pandemic by moving from city to country, the migration of older people into the countryside, affluent families buying second homes, and labour changes which have seen a shift from traditional agricultural jobs to services as cafes and restaurants cater for tourists. Our next book is from Matthew Desmond, who is a sociology professor at Princeton University and co-director of the Justice and Poverty Project. In 2015, he was the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. He is also the author of the award-winning book On the Fireline and other books dealing with race and poverty. Evicted tells the heartbreaking story of the individuals and families who struggle to get by in the United States' poorest cities. Despite their best efforts, many of these people have fallen into a vicious cycle of poverty that has left them at the mercy of greedy property owners who don't hesitate to evict families at the slightest provocation. Here he is speaking to PBS.
I think we focus a lot on jobs, we focus a lot on mass incarceration, welfare reform, but housing has been left out of the debate a little bit. We focused on public housing and we focused on neighborhoods, but the private rental market, where the vast majority of low-income families are living, has been largely overlooked. But here is this market that's taking most of what low-income families are making. They're deciding where.
Incredible amount, percentage of income. I mean, that's really striking.
Yes,
70, 80, 90%.
Yeah, that's what I saw when I was living with families in Milwaukee. And we reached a point today that we know that the majority of low-income renters are paying most of what they have just on rent and to keep the lights on. I'm thinking of Arlene. You know, Arlene was a single mom. She had 2 young boys. And when I met her, she was living in a pretty rundown apartment in a low-income neighborhood, giving 80% of her income on rent. You know, and she was facing terrible choices. You know, should I buy food or pay the rent? Should I contribute some money to the funeral or pay the rent? And someone like Arlene, eviction isn't necessarily the result of some irresponsibility. It's more inevitable. If you're someone like Arlene that's paying almost everything you have to the landlord, a very small divergence can invite an eviction. The book opens with her 14-year-old hitting a car with a snowball, you know, and the man jumping out, kicking in the door, and that causing the landlord to evict the family. You know, was that a bad choice? Eviction isn't just a condition of poverty, it's also a cause of it. It's making things worse.
At the time of writing in 2016, the number of people left without a home after running into difficulties paying rent reached the millions. You might think that a typical low-income family in the United States should be able to get by living in public housing or some form of housing assistance, but in reality, benefits like these are scarce. In fact, only 1 out of every 4 qualified recipients will receive any assistance at all. In Milwaukee, we know that over the course of 3 years, 1/8 of all the city's tenants faced eviction. However, census data can overlook a lot of evictions, since a considerable number aren't formally processed by the housing courts that handle disputes between property owners and tenants. No matter how you count it, evictions are a national problem. In 2012, New York City courts handled almost 80 eviction cases every day. That same year, 1 out of every 9 individuals or households renting a property in Cleveland, Ohio, received an eviction summons to appear in the housing court, and in Chicago it was 1 in 14. Even though the struggle to come up with rent money is nothing new, it used to be rare for landlords to resort to evictions, even during the Great Depression. During the 1930s and 40s, records show that an eviction led to the kind of community resistance that would cause a scandal for the landlord. This is what happened in February of 1932, when a landlord tried to evict 3 families in the Bronx. 1,000 people took to the streets in protest, and the New York Times made a point of noting that it would have been a bigger crowd if it weren't for the freezing cold temperatures. So why are evictions more common these days than ever before? One reason is highlighted in the housing studies conducted by Harvard University researchers. In the years between 2001 and 2014, rents increased by an average of 7%, while incomes fell by 9%. A standard measure of comfortable living suggests that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on rent. Otherwise, you won't be able to afford basic necessities like medicine and food. Yet census data shows that a majority of low-income households pay over 50% of their income on rent, while more than a quarter of these households pay over 70%. Part of the reason for this is the growing unemployment rate. Manufacturing jobs used to be a reliable source of income in cities like Milwaukee, which lost 56,000 of these very jobs between 1979 and 1983 to overseas competition. In Milwaukee today, 50% of working-age black men are jobless, and welfare benefits barely cover the costs of living. With such a limited budget, anything out of the ordinary can lead to falling behind on rent and in turn an eviction notice. Landlords are now preying on vulnerable tenants and are putting profits ahead of safety. Sharina Tava is one such landlady. When the house she was renting tragically caught fire one day, she knew the apartment was supposed to be equipped with smoke detectors, but she couldn't remember if they'd ever been installed. After the fire caused the death of her tenant's baby, she found out that she was off the hook and wouldn't be held accountable. This has led to exploitative conditions for tenants. Segregated inner cities and black women are the main targets for housing market exploitation. During a typical month in Milwaukee, 75% of tenants summoned to housing court are black. Meanwhile, white people are shown desirable properties that are never offered to black people who have no choice but to accept the worst housing in the worst neighborhoods. But it's black women who are hit hardest by evictions. Even though they make up just 9% of Milwaukee's population, they are subject to 30% of the evictions. This means that more than 1/5 of the city's black women will face eviction. For Hispanic women, that rate is 1 in 12, while for white women it's 1 in 15. One reason for this is that women continue to be paid less than men for doing the same work. More importantly, however, a large percentage of black women in poor neighborhoods are also facing the challenge of raising kids on their own. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was enacted to prevent housing discrimination. Unfortunately, it doesn't consider a single mum and her kids to be a target. Tenants are also at a disadvantage in housing courts, since 90% of landlords have attorneys, while only 10% of tenants do. Either way, tenants don't even show up 70% of the time, either because they can't afford to skip work, pay for childcare, or simply because they don't know if they'll stand a chance. It's no wonder that half of the mothers who have faced eviction report symptoms of clinical depression that can linger for years afterward, sapping their energy and optimism. It's also why the number of housing-related suicides doubled when rents skyrocketed between 2005 to 2010. The trend prompted a group of psychiatrists to call evictions a significant precursor to suicide. Evictions play a significant role in keeping people in the cycle of poverty. This kind of instability also increases the likelihood of job loss by 15%, usually due to the stress of eviction and the resulting housing search hurting an employee's performance. And in the year following an eviction, families face a 20% increase in hardships such as hunger and sickness, as well as a lack of heat, electricity, or a working phone line. Plus, these families might miss out on the important letters and benefit checks that may still be getting sent to the wrong address. Psychological stability goes hand in hand with community stability, because without it, people aren't going to invest in their neighborhoods, build relationships, or help one another. One possibility is to enact an expanded housing voucher program. Housing vouchers could be given to every family under a certain income level, and could act like food stamps that family currently use to buy groceries. In this case, tenants could spend 30% of their incomes on housing costs, while the vouchers would take care of the rest. This system is already implemented in the UK, where the housing benefit program is available to many households, though it still doesn't cover enough. And in the Netherlands, where housing allowances benefit nearly a third of the country's tenants. The undeniable truth is that something must be done to reduce eviction and homelessness rates in our society, because if we continue thinking of it as someone else's problem, it will only get worse, and society as a whole will continue to suffer. So to sum up, Yates says in All the Houses I've Ever Lived In that home is a gift and she revels in it every day. After so many years of feeling choked, she has somewhere that she wants to plant a root system so deep it carves its way into the root. She says maybe we are all looking to grow roots that are immovable. She also says it can be difficult not to feel like you are on a conveyor belt of temporary living, in constant suspension, as the market dictates that we dart from place to place. This way of living will be part of Gen Z's future and Gen Alpha's after that. A system that is infected with unconscious bias is not fit for purpose and needs a complete overhaul. Desmond says in Evicted that evictions cause irrevocable damage to individuals, families and communities and are part of the United States' systemic cycle of poverty, discrimination and exploitation. it's time for the US to start a campaign of housing reform, address this social epidemic with the help of housing vouchers, and recognize the basic human right to safe housing. As a fellow woman of colour who grew up in a single-parent household in social housing, the precarity is real. Whilst I was fortunate enough to move socially upward, the system is truly not fit for purpose. Please join in on the conversation by following at HowToBe247 on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and subscribe on the podcast, which can be found via www.howtobe247.com. Please do leave a review if you found this helpful and you want to be featured. Remember to check out the Patreon for exclusive unseen bonus material from every single interview, all for a price of a coffee. And don't forget to check out the new website and sign up for the newsletter. Before we go, here is Dr. Jack Drescher, psychoanalyst and past president of the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, on his thoughts. See you in 2 weeks' time.
Why do we need shelter and stability? Shelter and stability are hallmarks of human civilization. Today, we consider the most civilized societies to be those that make the effort to provide enough food, shelter, safety, and stability for its citizens. What happens if we don't have a stable home? Psychoanalysts like to talk about the external world and the internal world. The external world are the conditions in which we live: our homes, families, schools, neighborhoods, places of worship, and so on. As we grow and develop from children to adults, we take in the qualities of our external world, and those become the psychological foundation for our internal worlds. And although there are always exceptions, usually being raised in a stable external world facilitates the development of a stable internal world. Not having that kind of stability, as we recently saw in the COVID pandemic, can lead to an increase in mental health problems.